See my purty blue eyes.
Absolutely. Well, cool. We'll hop in here in earnest. It's wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
taking a minute out today. I appreciate it.
absolutely. Glad to do it. Thanks for the invitation.
Yes, sir. So before we get into the work that you're doing right now to curb this
Mhm.
anxiety, I want to know this. You kind of mentioned the pandemic. 6 years ago, this thing was changing everybody, changing the world. How did you actually get through that era, and how has it influenced the way that you work and do things today?
Yeah, interesting question to start with, Joe. So I think 2018, I released a book called The 5 Day Solution, or yeah, The 5 Day Stage Fright Solution. And that was built on the work I was doing with my students. I directed a popular music program at Catawba College in North Carolina. And that was built upon, actually, if we take that story way back, to me studying under a Zen master, Korean Zen master, Sahn, who was also the teacher of Jon Kabat-Zinn, who developed mindfulness, right? So I kind of fly the flag of mindfulness as kind of abbreviation, but really but John used a number of different influences in creating mindful, but one of them was the teaching of this Zen master, right? So my book, this 5 Day Stage Fright Solution, I released it again based on the work I was doing with my student musicians. And it did very well, got lots of, wonderful testimonials and reviews. And it wasn't just performers, right? It was also people who are speaking in public and also athletes, right? So I like to say, Joe, that my mother didn't raise no idiot. She left that to my father for the most part. Uh, so I thought, well, it's understandable that this solution that I'm offering is applicable to those three sorts of groups: speech fright and stage fright and competition anxiety. So I was going to turn it into a live sort of thing with online courses. Then the pandemic hit, and there wasn't much public speaking going on except over Zoom, right?
Yeah.
And the live performance had a hole in the bottom of it. So, I just kind of rode out the pandemic, and I did some things in between. But then in just the past year, I have turned what I do into an online course for three separate audiences. So I have a perform with confidence, a speak with confidence, and a compete with confidence.
So I want to know right now, along with the work that you're doing with the book, and overall, if I was to put you in front of kids at career day, 13-year-old
Mhm.
year old kids, and they wanted to know what you do for a living, what is your day job? How do you explain what you do to them to make sense to them?
Sure. I help people who experience anxiety when they speak in front of others, perform in front of others, or compete in front of others, find a way beyond that.
So, what did you want to be when you were that age? What was your dream job when you were a kid?
Yeah, touch upon this when we first logged on here. I was a jazz musician. I was a really hardcore jazzer of absolutely no repute. But I was, a jazz musician, and I was pretty hot, hotshot musician actually. In high school, into college, I went to Western Michigan University, which had one of the first, big jazz programs in the country. Um, I got out of college and, went out to LA to pursue that dream and realized how many talented musicians there were out there, especially jazz saxophonists.
Yeah.
So that dream of the 13-year-old kid being the next Art Pepper or something like that. Like I said, my mother didn't raise no idiot. I decided for myself there wasn't much future in that.
So I want to know, how did you go from being a musician to this place where you're helping people get over stage fright? How did this evolution,
Yeah.
what were the seeds early on that were planted that became who you are today?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so hotshot musician, right? In practice and rehearsals, Joe, I did really well. Put me in front of an audience, and that confidence was undermined by performance anxiety, by stage fright, right? As a musician. The odd thing was nobody really talked about it. Other musicians didn't talk about it. There were no books on it to even, there was no really internet at that point to look
Yeah.
anything up. So in fact, one night, my first big gig as a saxophonist, I got the chance to be in the backing band for Sonny and Cher. That ages me, doesn't it? Right? So, I was sitting there, and in front of tens of thousands of people, and I froze. They were playing the intro vamp for Sonny and Cher to come on, so the rhythms. I froze and missed the cue for the ensemble. And the only thing that brought me out of it was the director saying, "Play, damn it." So, directed at me specifically.
Yeah.
So from early on, I experienced stage fright, and the higher the stakes, the worse it was. But again, I thought there must be something wrong with me because nobody's talking about this.
Yeah.
There were no classes on it in college. My teachers didn't talk about it other than maybe suck it up, kid, or something like that.
Yeah.
So then when I became a young professor, the stage fright, metastasized into speech fright, right? So now I'm nervous when I'm in front of a large class, hundreds of, especially as a young professor, right? I remember one of the very first classes I taught. I went in and was talking about African music to a world music class. I was actually a substitute professor for this. And I said some, professed some profound statement about African music, and a hand shot up and said, "Professor, I'm from Africa." And I thought, oh, so as a young professor, you're professing all sorts of stuff you really don't know well. So there's all sorts of risk involved. And then you're in faculty meetings, and you're debating Professor Rumpel stuff, right? And so what had been stage fright became speech fright. But again, nobody was talking about it, right? And there were no really resources to help people about it. So that's how I got into it.
So, what was the big leap for you? How did you get to the point where you got comfortable, where you kind of got over the mental block? How did that happen?
Well, I can't say, and I never say to anybody that you're going to get over it, that you're going to conquer it, that you're going to defeat it. And to not get into the weeds too much, but my formula for why performance anxiety strikes is you do your thing in front of others, an audience. Now that audience could be just one person. If let's say it's a job interview, right? Second factor is that audience is judging you, or at least you feel like they're judging you. Right. So that could be, let's go back, job interview. You don't, they're judging you whether you deserve this job or not. Right. If you're auditioning for Juilliard, they're deciding on whether to accept you at Juilliard. Okay. So the third factor then, and what it really hinges on, is if that judgment was negative, it constitutes some sort of threat. Right. You don't get the job. You don't get into Juilliard. It may be more existential, more subtle. You lose respect in front of people that, that you work with, whatever it might be, right? Okay. So I never say, so to this day, Joe, if those factors are at play for me, I'll still get nervous. 75% of us do. Study after study shows that 75% of us are prone to that. And it doesn't matter. Shohei Ohtani talked about how nervous he was playing in front of his home country fans in Tokyo a year ago, right? So, what does he have to be nervous about, right? But yet there must have been some sort of threat there for him to feel nervous. So I called it, trying to conquer this. It's a dead man's goal, the type of goal only a dead person could achieve, right?
Yeah.
So maybe to reframe the question a little bit. So I studied under this Korean Zen master. And Sahn had this wonderful all-purpose precept. He used to say, only go straight, don't know. And the only go straight is just do what you mean to do, do the task at hand. That's, part of this Zen adage about when you walk, only walk. When you eat, only eat. When you speak, only speak, right? When you're playing a solo, only play the solo. The don't know part is keep don't know mind, which is mean we have this thing back of our heads, the amygdala. Its job is to always be looking, it's an internal bodyguard, and it's always looking for risks, right? Looking for danger. And it's, not part of our conscious thinking system. It's our autonomic nervous system. It kicks in, whether you say there's a threat or not. If it senses a threat, it's there. It jumps in to help you. Thing is, the only way it knows how to help you is through pumping adrenaline through your system. It's the only play it's got, right?
Yeah.
So, all right. So taking it back. So I studied under Sahn. I said this is all-purpose precept. And those of us who studied with it, we used it in all aspects of our lives, all sorts of things. I remember asking him, do I need to be Buddhist to study Zen? And his answer was, only go straight, study Zen. As far as do I need to be Buddhist? Set that aside. Just don't know.
Yeah.
Right? So anyway, over time, Joe, I started applying it to my performing and speaking in front of others. Right.
So who's been that inspiration for you to navigate in your life, from music to where you're at now, to help people get on stage? Have you had a heroic figure in your life that's allowed you to become you?
Yeah, I have, again, being a musician, they have been musicians, but it's sort of an assorted lot of them. One of my big inspirations was Harry Chapin, right?
Yeah.
And I've gotten to know his family a little bit since then. A very early inspiration for me, and I got to work with him a tiny little bit, was Don Ellis, the wonderful 13, 16, jazz artist. Don was just wonderful, and I became my PhD is in ethnomusicology, right? Yeah. So, and specifically, I studied Japanese music, right? Yeah. I think a lot of it came from being around Don and seeing his and absorbing that influence, because he studied Indian music and Bulgarian music. And I thought that was just such a gas, man.
Yeah.
Just why does, and he got beat up a lot for bringing all this stuff into jazz, right? Yeah. His name's Miles Davis, okay. But does jazz only have to be Miles Davis, right?
Right.
So,
yeah.
So early on, I'd probably say it was Don Ellis.
And I think that the world of jazz can thank him now, because he was one of those early people, kind of when the Beatles brought the sitar in, those influences. Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned Miles, because Miles is the example of pushing that boundary out and never going back to anything. Like, I don't think he ever wanted to play his early material ever when he would play in the 70s and 80s. He was always kind of moving through his movements. So it's just funny how history will find their way of either lauding you or, I mean, because even Ornette Coleman and all those guys, when they were coming in with all those odd meters and things that just didn't sound like traditional jazz, they got beat up. But eventually now they're heroes. They have bred this whole other subgenre of jazz.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ellis had a foot in that with avant-garde jazz. He would talk about how his first shows that he would throw buckets of raw fish into the audience. So, but back to the point. Yeah, he certainly wasn't mainstream jazz, but, I certainly, for one, adored him for that. Right.
So, we've seen examples. I remember that movie, The King's Speech, where there
Mm-hmm.
was there was a speech issue, and there's been others that have kind of centered around that. Is there anybody out there that's overcome their stage fright that you would love to talk to? Is there a seminal example?
Yeah, again, from my experience, and this is working now with hundreds of folks, if not a thousand or more. There's no cure. Nobody ever gets over this. A prime example, Shohei Ohtani is a prime example. Kamala Harris is a prime example. I saw her give a speech just a couple blocks from here on the street in what's historic, it was known as Black Wall Street, right? And it was like in front of maybe a couple hundred fans, if you will, supporters. She was as calm and in control as she could possibly be. Now, a couple of weeks later, she did her first debate, or was it the only debate? I forget, with Trump, and she was obviously nervous,
Yeah.
right? So, here, giving this little talk in Durham, North Carolina, there was no big risk for her, but put her on a national stage where this could spell whether she gets elected or not elected. And I'm sure she had, those, memories of what happened to Nixon and his debate with Kennedy and how that, just undermined his. So I don't know anybody. I would want to debate anybody who says that they have conquered stage fright.
Yeah.
Right. Now, that's for 75%. 25% of us, I don't know who those people are, they don't experience this sort of fear when they face risk. So.
It's interesting too because what you're talking about is a myriad of elements of our psychology that can come in there. And the reason why I say this is I remember years ago, I was in my 20s. I was kind of detoxing off of corporate America. So I started working for the United Way and I was doing a campaign. And we were at a school and a big sports broadcaster from Kansas City came in and he was terrified to talk to the kids. And I was like, "What's up, man? What are you okay?" He was like, "I can get in front of a camera. I can talk to the whole county, city, no problem. But you get me in
Yeah.
front of kids." And I've heard people that have been in that scenario before. They're fine with one group, but you get into another group and they're just, I mean, he was
Yeah.
terrified. He was
Yeah.
shaking. And I was like, how can
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
be? But it's that
Yeah.
weird level of psychology that comes in.
Yeah, well, and yes, I know it seems weird, and it seems weird to the person probably too, right? A good friend of mine, another professor, we had this little Japanese festival ensemble, that we'd rehearse once a week, and then we would give a performance each semester. And this is a Joe, a renowned scholar who gave, keynote speeches at conferences around the world, and she was great with that, but put her on, this little Japanese bell, and she would, while we're waiting to go on, she said, I think I'm going to pee. I'm going to pee. I'm so nervous. I'm going to pee. Right. So how is it? Right. Okay. So here's the thing. Um, Surface worries and deep dangers. Often, what we experience is the surface worry. Oh, why am I nervous in speaking in front of these kids? Okay, well, there's a technique in therapy. I'm not a therapist, but there's a technique in therapy called the downward arrow. So you ask yourself, okay, if that happened, if I bomb in front of these kids, what does that mean? Then what? So you take that and say, oh, okay, if that happens, then what? Yeah, okay, if that happens, then what? You'll eventually get down to some sort of, rock hard surface that really is a legitimate threat almost always, right? It's just kind of masked by these. And that's why it's easy for people to think there's something wrong with them, right?
Yeah.
That they're getting upset over nothing, yeah, and so forth. But in my experience, Joe, that's not the case. There's almost always a legitimate a threat at the bottom of everything.
So as you developed this 5-day stage fright solution, what was the the empirical data that was conclusive enough for you to make this into a book? How were you convinced that this was a method that you wanted to give to the world?
Yeah, I've never done clinical studies with the for people. But first, it worked with me,
Yeah.
right? And I was actually, yeah, let's go back again to my mother didn't raise no idiot, right? I looked for books to help my students with stage fright, and there weren't any out there, right? And so this is like mid to 20 teens. And so I thought, well, somebody's got to write a book. I'm somebody. I'll write. But I don't know anything about helping people. I thought at that point, right? Um, so I decided, well, I'll partner with a therapist, and she can bring the knowledge, and I'll take home half the royalties, and it's a great deal. So we would have these sessions, brainstorming sessions, and she asked me, well, what do you do about your speech writing stage fright? I said, well, it's kind of quirky, and I studied with this Zen master, and he taught us how to detach ourselves from nervous thoughts, other thoughts, but nervous thoughts in this context. He said, have you heard of mindfulness? I said, no. She said, this sounds a lot like mindfulness. Here's a book by Jon Kabat-Zinn. Why don't you look into it? And that's when I found out. Yeah, I read the book and went, this looks really interesting. Well, looks very familiar. And then I looked at the back of the book and saw that he had studied with Sahn as well. So that was kind of the first thing, is that there's a lot of evidence that it's studies that have shown the efficacy of mindfulness, right? Now, it got overblown, right? It can cure hangnails. It can. Fortunately, we've trimmed back a little bit. I think the world has trimmed back from that giddiness about mindfulness, but it is a very effective solution for problems because it doesn't worry about why am I worried about this? Again, because that's coming from the amygdala, right? So in the moment, you just need something to shut it up and for you to only go straight, right? Okay. So I rest a lot of that, my belief that this mindfulness is effective in those studies, but then also with what I started working with my students, at Catawba College, when I went out of we aborted that co-write, and the therapist said, you don't need me, just teach what you learned from Sahn, right? And it worked. It was very helpful in a way that nothing else was for my students. So that's the second thing. And then with the book, there have just been so many testimonials, and that I've plenty, preponderance of evidence, Your Honor, that it's effective.
So I got to know, if you had a dream tonight, you ran into that young 18-year-old version of
Mm-hmm.
you, ready to be the next Art Pepper, and you walked in the room and there was a film projector and you click play, and a 60-second highlight reel of your life, the evolution to where you're at now, the lives you're changing through helping people through stage fright. Would that young version of you believe that your life turned out this way?
Yes, a great question. Okay, so my other hustle is that I help college-bound musicians identify best fit schools and then audition for them, right? And one of the things I consult with young students is side hustles. Joe, just about every musician I have ever known has needed a side hustle,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Michael, who touring guitarist for Prince, flips houses. It's so. I would have told myself, don't put all of your eggs in the basket of being a jazz phenom. Yeah, you might be successful at that, but to sustain that, it's going to be really helpful for you to have other interests that you can bring into that. So my side hustle was being a music professor. Right?
Yeah.
I taught about music rather than making music, right? And now this and a few other things as well. So that's what I'd say to that 18-year-old.
Yeah.
Don't put in what I do to 17, 16, with 16, 17-year-olds now, develop a side hustle,
Yeah.
graphic arts, producing,
Hmm.
music business. Yeah. So
Yeah, for sure. So when you look at that 60-second highlight reel of your life, what are you the proudest of? What are you the happiest about?
yeah, I would say this, Joe. Now through the years, I've known thousands of musicians. I'm not just saying professional musicians. I'm one of the few that still, in one way or another, at my ripe old age, for my ripe old age, making music. And I
Yeah.
wasn't the most talented, right? I mean, Renaissance Records came out with an album of my folk rock music a couple of years ago. It was produced by David Kirschenbaum, right? It has some really hot studio musicians. I'm really proud of that. But I knew much more talented guys back in the day, Joe, that just because they put all their eggs in one basket, maybe, or just it got too tough for them or whatever. So I'm most proud of the fact. Yeah, one of my songs says, I'm still standing, not where I thought I'd be, but I'm still standing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So I think that's what I'm most proud of.
So let me ask you this. Everyone has a perception of you. Family,
Mhm.
friends, everyone that knows you as a musician, everyone that gets your book, everyone in all these bubbles, but you run the show. What's your
Yeah.
perception of you? Who do you think you are?
You know, that's also another great question, thought-provoking question. Um, so I really absorbed so much of Song's teachings when I was at a very impressionable age, I guess. And I try not to have because of that, I try not to have perceptions of myself. Am I successful? Am I not successful? Am I wise? Am I not wise? I just try to keep only go straight and keep don't know mine. Let the other people, everybody else can have ideas about who I am. Yeah, of course, for the people who matter most to me, like my wife and son and so forth, I think it matters more. But sincerely, I really do try to not worry about that so
Yeah.
much. Mm.
I got to know, what was the first live jazz show you saw that blew you away?
Well, first live jazz show that blew me away was Miles Davis, but because he was
Wow.
an hour and a half late and he turned his back to the audience the whole
Oh
time.
no. You were at one of those. Oh no.
Yeah. I tell you what blew me away more was a master class I had with Dexter Gordon.
Wow.
Right, he was brought into my community college in Tucson, Arizona, and this was really the early days of jazz musicians doing this sort of thing. So he didn't know what to say, right, and he's just this, you know, huge
Long,
man,
tall
right.
Dexter.
Right. Yeah. So so the jazz director tried to get him to say a few things, and finally he said, "Oh, let's screw it. Let's just jam."
The Dexter way. Speaking of COVID, the last thing I did before everything shut down, I believe it was on the 12th or 13th of March, Maxine Gordon, his widow, was at the college here in town and she had his book.
Oh, yeah.
And she
Right.
signed it and she put the date on it. And I remember as the months went by, I was like, how profound is that? And I ended up talking to her about it.
Yeah.
And she said, I'm going to start putting the date on all of my
Mm.
signatures from here on out because of that, because it was just such a
Yeah.
big moment. But it was
Yeah.
it was a
Oh,
wonderful book.
wow.
And Dexter was so cool. He was a part of that crop of of innovators that went to Europe and then came back, and
Oh yeah,
just
yeah,
that whole
yeah.
lineage. Yeah.
Yeah, whether it was he was an immigrant or an exile or in exile or whatever it was. Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think for the African American population, I think to go over like Ben Webster, they
yeah.
finally felt like they were
Mhm.
human. They weren't shuttled to one side of the food
Yep,
counter or the other, and it was a way of feeling free.
yeah.
So,
Well, and Miles Davis did that as well
uh-huh.
for a brief period, right?
Yeah,
And that he brought back a lot of a different attitude because of that, I think, right?
yeah, for sure.
About himself and the place of Black Americans and Black society and jazz and all that good stuff. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So, if anybody wants to get a copy of the 5-day stage fright solution, get their hands on your music, any of the other wonderful work that you're doing, where's the best place to go?
Yeah, I should point out the 5-day solution is being deprecated, right? I have grown so much since then that there's going to be a new book coming out just in a month or so here. It's called Speak, Perform, and Compete with Confidence. Okay. And so you can find those online courses, those 3 online courses: Speak with Confidence, Perform with Confidence, and Compete with Confidence. We're still working on that. That's one I really did need somebody to co-author with me because I'm no athlete, right? So, but anyway, Joe, they can go to my website, riseup8.com. And 8 is spelled out, EIGHT. Riseup8.com, and you'll find all of that stuff and links to other things that I do. I'd be happy to interloculate with folks.
I
Right?
love it. And I will put that link in the those show notes, and make sure that it's easy. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. A myriad of
Yeah.
things that we touched on. So thank you so much for taking a minute out for the show today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, for the invitation. I love your show.
Thank you.
And, some really thought-provoking questions. I typically get asked the questions that I give, right, to the
Right.
podcast. And I got those down, right? I had to actually think a couple seconds on that.
Well, you're an
I
improv
love
guy.
it, man.
You
Yeah,
were
well,
right there.
that's right. That's right. That's
that-
right. That's one of the things we come out of with jazz, right?
That's it. That's the backbone.